Hello, everybody. Welcome to the discussion of Tony Williams' article. This is the briefer lecture of the two this week. The next lecture on The Shining is going to be a little bit longer, so in terms of scheduling, this is going to be our shorter one, but a very important one. Today we're talking about 1980s horror films. In particular, the 80s was an era known for the slasher film. This was when the slasher film really became mainstream and extremely popular. You had Friday the 13th, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and these became mega films. I mean, they spawned countless sequels. I think the most recent Nightmare on Elm Street is number 38 or something like this. I mean, it's absurd how popular and how long-lasting the longevity of these films. So to get into Tony Williams' argument, we have to first form or address the counter-argument that's being made. He kind of sets up a straw man of sorts. And he does so with Carol Clover, whose famous and very amazingly titled film, a book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Classic title for her book, and I want to walk through a couple of her major points and then discuss what Tony Williams says about the 1980s, and then we can kind of get at the heart of what was happening. The first point I want to make, the final girl. The final girl is something that is used now, it's part of the vocabulary of anyone who studies the horror film or the horror genre. The final girl is the phenomenon in these kinds of slasher films in which the last person standing is a young woman. And so she has somehow survived where all of her friends, all of the other characters in the film, typically you have a token African-American character, as the running joke is, who is killed very early on. And then you have a cast of misbehaving young women who, in their disobedience to social norms, are punished accordingly by the monster at the heart of the film. The one girl who remains standing at the end is typically the one who is the most pure, the one who resists smoking cigarettes, who resists any kind of physical relationship with the other male characters. She's the one who stays at home, does her homework, and is all around a wholesome, good American girl. That's the final girl. And for Clover, the final girl is really a positive sign. It's a sign of women's liberation, that women have become empowered enough that they can do battle with their own inner demons, with their own monsters, and they can stand the test of time and stand strong at the end. The second point that Clover wants to make, and this is perhaps the less well-known point, but the more lasting point, is that there's a kind of Norman Bates syndrome that runs through these 1980s horror films, and that is a kind of sadomasochistic tendency for the monster and the victim to be enmeshed or entangled with one another. That there is a kind of overlap of perception in which the monster and the victim play out throughout the film, so that at times the spectator is able to take on the persona of being the monster, and at other times the spectator takes on the perspective of being the victim. And that's why it's sadomasochistic. We like to do the punishing, and we like to be punished. And this, of course, we've already seen in Psycho. This is hardly new in the 1980s, but it does become something that is more mainstream. And Clover wants to see this as being as creating a slippage in gender identity, in that there's something kind of interesting or innovative going on, that men do not have a stable identity point, nor do women, that they must negotiate or navigate the kind of gray area in between. And so we might call this Norman Bates syndrome, but Clover is very much interested in the sadomasochistic pleasures of watching horror films and the gender trouble that that brings. Now, to get to Tony Williams' argument, he's going to say it's wonderful to have these issues of identity slippage. That's, in some ways that breaks down older traditional categories that are probably too worn out to be useful anymore. It's also useful to discuss the final girl because there is something there that is clearly different from, let's say, Marion in Psycho, because she doesn't make it to the final reel of the film. However, Williams is going to counter this with a couple of points. In regards to the Norman Bates syndrome, William writes on page 168, "Whatever oscillating subject positions may result, an act of patriarchal physical violence is being perpetuated." So basically William says it's true, there is some slippery territory, and it's true that the spectator must align differently, but that doesn't matter because at the heart of the issue is there's a female victim, and there is violence being enacted by some kind of, at least associatively, male monster. And so women and violence being perpetuated against women is at the heart of these films in a troubling fashion for Williams. And he says, as much as Clover wants to redeem the slasher film from the 80s, he wants to say, wait a minute, there's something perhaps a little bit interesting going on there, but that does not take away from its downside, which is let's celebrate, or let's at least permit there to be violence perpetuated against women and have that as a form of entertainment. The second issue that Williams is going to have is the final girl is actually an illusion, he says. In truth, at least up until the later 80s, in the 90s things will start to change again, but in the mid to early 80s, there's the illusion of the final girl, but in fact it is typically a male character, a male authority figure that is assisting the female in their efforts to save the day. So, for example, in Halloween, Dr. Loomis is going to serve a pivotal role and come in to save the final girl at the end of the film. And so perhaps we think, well, the final girl in Halloween really is stepping up and empowered and standing up against these kinds of, all of these corrupting forces in her life. But in fact, she only goes so far. Dr. Loomis is the one who actually takes care of the final deed, and she kind of is crumpled in a ball crying at the end. So Williams wants to say, let's hold off and recognize that, yes, we celebrate the virtues of the final girl, but we do so without truly empowering them to defend themselves. That role belongs to the male. Again, late 80s, Williams acknowledges this will begin to change, but in the mid to early 80s, women are still being taken care of by some kind of male figure. All right, so to take us back to Andrew Tudor's argument, remember, about paranoid horror and secure horror, in that article he stresses that we really can't come up with any kind of secure definition of why people like horror. people watch horror films at different times for different reasons, and these are different individuals, and we have to appreciate that. So he really, Williams goes back to Tudor, informing his argument here. So it's absolutely pivotal that we understand the difference between the 1970s and the 1980s. The 1970s was a time in which Williams acknowledges there was much innovation and progressive thinking in the horror film. It was radically changed. A lot of really interesting films come out in the 70s. And these films will radically change the dynamic of the genre itself. But in the 80s, things begin to change, and the films actually begin to revert back to more conservative norms. They begin to scale it back and have a more ideologically sound or more traditionally based message at the heart of the film. So less radical thinking going on there. Why, we might ask? Well, in order to do that, you'd have to understand the 80s. I know some of you will remember the 80s. Some of you will not remember the 80s, but at the heart of it is President Reagan's appeal to family values, and that was a very concerted effort on the part of the Reagan administration to advocate family above all, and in order to do so, they had to create a sense that the family was under siege, or there was a threat to the nuclear family. That is the traditional mother, father, 2.5 kids, white picket fence, mother stays at home, father goes to work. This kind of traditional form was under threat, and it had to somehow be preserved. And so that was the message, the PR message of the administration at the time. Williams is going to say, well, that actually works out very well. The horror films in question really help to advocate that position. They actually work to create a kind of barricade, or to get behind the message of the Reagan administration and support it with its particular eccentricities. So, and this is really important because it's a question of historical context versus theoretical importance, whereas Clover's book wants to talk all about the theoretical, psychoanalytical aspects of these slasher films and kind of redeem them or make them more liberated or progressive. Williams is going to say we have to follow Tudor's lead and recognize that at the heart of this there is a historical context that is shaping the horror film. What's happening in the 1980s has a direct influence on the kind of teachable moments at the center of these films. One of them, according to Williams, one of these kinds of moments is the threat of the family breaking apart, the threat of parents who neglect their duties to take care of their children. Often you'll see in these films young women, often serving as babysitters or something like this, not being tended to by their parents in the right way. The parents kind of disappear, and they're not there to protect their children in the way that the audience is meant to say, well, if only the parents had been there, then everything would have been okay. Then they could have been saved from all of these hardships. So, parents missing in action. Another thing is the role of the children. The children are becoming more and more disobedient. They usually dabble in some kind of drug use or drinking. They disobey their parents. They engage in various kinds of sexualized activity with boyfriends or girlfriends. And so there's this kind of corruption of the family ideal. And if the Reagan administration is saying The family is under siege. The traditional family is under siege in America. These films actually go a long way to confirm that suspicion, because quite literally in the slasher films, the family is directly under siege by an actual projected other with a capital O. So that's actually really the kind of mode of operation going on here in these films. This actually is important because it forecasts us a little bit ahead into Stephen King's The Shining. Actually, it's a little bit behind because The Shining's written at the end of the 70s, but we could look at The Shining as a pivot forward into the culture of the 80s. In The Shining, as we're going to discuss in the next lecture, here we have a nuclear family under siege, falling apart, losing its sense of cohesion, and so all of these things are just kind of disintegrating before our eyes. And the audience is meant to say, or meant to root for the family coming back together and protecting itself against the invaders from the outside, including these various social forces, drug use, sex, neglectful parenting, these kinds of things. So, this is all part of the 80s culture. It fits in very well. Why is this a particularly conservative or traditional message going on here? Well, because if in previous films that we have seen, and we could think of Psycho, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and even further back into things like Dracula and Frankenstein, typically, before the 80s, the return of the repressed was largely viewed as a kind of subversive thing. When the monsters or demons or unsavory things were returned from our unconscious to haunt us, that was seen as in some ways, a positive thing, because it was subverting an over-rationalized or an arrogant, we can think of Manfred here as our prototype. The return of the repressed really does a lot to unsettle an overconfident or arrogant protagonist. So the subversive quality is very, very important. Here in the 80s, though, the return of the repressed actually works to justify the repression, because things get so chaotic and terrifying that actually at the end of the film, people would like to return to repression. They don't want the return of the repressed. They want a return to repression, because at least repression doesn't have these nightmarish monsters and these excesses, this disobedience on so many levels. The 1980s consumer really wants to say, let's bunker down and repress a lot of these unspoken or unseen things. Let's pretend that none of these things exist and repress them outside of the home. So that's the big difference, and that's something you always want to pay attention to when you're talking about slasher films in the 1980s. Prior films predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly celebrate return of the repressed as a subversive ideal to improve society. In the 1980s slasher films, as Williams argues so well in his essay, there's actually a need to celebrate repression, or to validate repression and say, see, all of your fears and concerns were justified. They were legitimate. We're better off when we are repressed and living in more conservative or traditional ways. So, I hope you enjoyed that article, and I hope this will ring some bells with you if you are familiar with any of these series from the 80s. Hopefully this will help you to think about them in new ways. Next time we will be discussing The Shining, that tremendous novel, which I would say is probably the most important horror novel in the latter part of the 20th century in America, because it captures so well the history of the American Gothic and the future of where it would go moving into the 21st century. So lots to talk about. Enjoy it, and I will talk to you next time.